Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are finally here. It is time for my LPL Finals overview and analysis video in the spring split playoffs. It's the final series that we get in the LPL for the entirety of the spring split, and of course it will determine the team that gets to hang their name and their likeness in the rafters forever. Winning a championship in the LPL is not an easy feat, and both of these teams are trying to do so coming from very different pathways to get here, not only in terms of their history, because obviously these two orgs are very different in the long run, but also even just in their recent performances, both definitely entering here with something to prove. So I'm very excited. I hope you guys are as well. Of course, if you are, let me know down in the comments section below. What did you expect to happen here today? What did you expect to happen between these two teams? And did it live up to your expectations? Were you surprised by the outcome or potentially how we got there? Any player performances that shocked you? I'm always curious to know where you guys land on a lot of these games down in the comments section below, but I don't want to waste you guys' time too much today. We've, been waiting a couple of days to get this LPL video out with so many other regions having to build up to the finals, but it is finally time for us to talk about this gigantic one, so let's get into it. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go game by game, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of the video, I will be giving a finals MVP, a player of the series, to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We'll be talking about everything throughout the entire series, but nothing to preview, nothing to talk about at the end. This is the final series in the LPL. The winner obviously still going to MSI as the #1 team, immediately slotted into the main stage of MSI, where the loser will have to go through the play-ins, but let's be honest, the real prize at the end of the tunnel is that championship trophy that they are both playing for. So without further ado, let's get into the analysis, shall we? Of course, you can already see the matchup up on your screen. You probably already knew it coming into this video. It's the #2 seeded Anyone's Legend taking on the #4 seeded Bilibili Gaming, and I couldn't have been more direct when I said it earlier, and I talked about how these two teams are basically coming here with complete opposite results, both in the long term and the short term. We'll start with our favorite, the team that has yet to lose in the playoffs up until this point, coming from winners finals, Anyone's Legend. And the reason it's so interesting to see this team here is not only because of the organization's history, which we will talk about, but these players' history in particular. A lot of players on this team that have not found the success that maybe their talent level would indicate throughout their entire careers. Players like Tarzan, players like Shanks, that are looking for their first LPL titles, despite kind of being regarded as some of the best players in the world over the past couple of years. A player in KL, who I've been very vocal about talking about being like one of the best supports in the world. You have someone like Flandra, who has obviously been able to do it at this level, but look at the history of Anyone's Legend as an organization. This is a team that's thrown, thing after thing after thing at the wall, just trying to figure out what's going to stick. Obviously, selfishly, I can talk about my personal history with Anyone's Legend, even going back to the Rogue Warrior days. They are a team that I've always supported here in the LPL. Kind of talked about how I always think they're underrated. Xiao Hao was a player who I was going to bat for a long time on this channel, and every single offseason, it felt like I was like, okay, this is the year AL actually does well. Very similar to how I talk about a team like Excel over in the LEC, or how I talk about a team like DRX over in the LCK, where it just never seemed to click, regardless of how nice the changes and the thought process and the decision-making I thought was from the ownership and all the people involved with AL. It never really translated to any success at the LPL level. That kind of changed last year in the summer split when they brought on a couple of new pieces, most specifically, obviously, Ala in the top lane to pair with that nice core that they had been able to build in the offseason, that Krako, Shanks, Hope, and KL core, and ended up getting them into at least a pretty decent spot. There were times where they were viewed as a top 3, top 4 team in the LPL. They ended up, I believe, in 6th place by the end of summer split, but that was already such a fantastic result compared to what this team normally was doing at this level. And then they come back and they upgrade even more going into 2025. Flandra is added on the top side, which at the time looked like a downgrade. I thought going from Ala to Tarzan was making your team, or I'm sorry, from Ala to Flandra was making your team worse, because Flandra was not nearly as good last year for JD Gaming. In fact, I thought Sheer was better for that JDG team, but it all kind of turned around when you're swapping out Krako, who is a good player, somebody who I like quite a bit, for Tarzan, who might as well be the biggest channel darling now, at least on this channel in its history. It's between him and Zeka who you want to kind of give that title to in terms of the biggest channel darling. KL's obviously in that conversation as well for players that I've just been pounding the table for ever since 2022, but that was the missing piece. They needed somebody to come in and be able to stabilize, and also to be able to run their early game to allow players like Shanks and Hope and KL the ability to play out their late game strengths and to really dominate games using their mechanics where they are really good, and that's what Tarzan has brought to this team. It's been a ton of success. They made finals in and Winter. Obviously, they couldn't quite take down Top Esports in that regard, but they're undefeated in the playoffs up until this point, and they already took down BLG in Winners Finals. They have the advantage and the confidence going into this series, but Bilibili is certainly not a pushover team. All of these players, really with the exception of Beishwan, know what it's like to dominate the LPL. Bin, Knight, Elk, and On won both titles in the LPL last year. They dominated the entire stretch of Chinese League of Legends. They made World Finals as a unit, and now they're back here, sitting here in Spring Finals, and you're looking at that and you're going, well, obviously they're going to be coming in here as favorites, but I just told you guys they lost in Winners Finals. They've had a lot of, trouble this year. It's been tumultuous for this team, so much so that the jungler that I haven't brought up yet, Beishwan, he's a new addition to this team. They actually had to go and swap way out of the jungle because they just couldn't find their footing. They looked like a team that might not even be top 4, let alone a team that's going to try to compete to win the LPL. But they bring Beishwan in. They just get somebody in the building that's going to allow the other players on this team that are already some of the best in the entire world to actually play like the best in the world instead of, shout out to Wei, instead of him being there and being such a resource hog that, players like Bin and Knight and Elk couldn't actually carry games because all the resources were being taken away from them rather than given to them. Having Beishwan come in and be able to stabilize this team was gigantic, but the reason I say that that's the opposite of AL is AL's been super consistent all year long. BLG looked like a team that was nowhere near this spot even just a couple of months ago, so them finding their footing, them getting in good form as of late is obviously not surprising to anybody who knows the talent level of this team, but it certainly is a welcome change. But that's on top of the fact that this team has been the most successful in the LPL over the past year and a half. Again, they dominated all of 2024. They shocked people in 2023 when they overperformed expectations and ended up being one of the scarier teams in the world back in 2023. Nobody really saw either of those, turns coming. I think 2024, I was definitely on the train when they added Knight. It really felt like, one of those changes that really elevates a team to being one of the best in the world when you add arguably the best player in the world. But, it's taken them some, time to kind of get back to that status. And I think that's why it's such an interesting matchup. AL trying to claim their first title in LPL history, trying to really cement themselves as an upper tier org, and a lot of these players trying to cement themselves as some of the best players in the world. BLG's already done that. They've gotten the titles and the trophies. They've gotten the accolades. These players are regarded incredibly highly, but they've kind of proven that they've fallen off a little bit. They need to reassert themselves in terms of being considered one of the scarier teams in the world. It's a really fun matchup between two really fun teams. My prediction going into this, as you guys know if you watched my semifinals video, was BLG 3-2. I still believe that talent-wise they are the more talented team and they should be going into this as favorites regardless of how Winners Finals went. That series was incredibly close. Both teams I think played very, very well, and I think it's just going to be up to execution here today, but we will see if that prediction ages well or if AL can surprise everybody and end up winning their first ever title. The only way to know is, of course, to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Anyone's Legend. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0, and this is a big, big way to start a final series. Winning this first game, I talk about it all the time on this channel, but it's such an important piece towards the puzzle in a best of 5. Games 1 and 3 are really the ones you kind of have to win no matter where you are in the series, because either it changes the complexity of the series, like in game 1's case, or it can really solidify it, like in game 3's case. For AL, having Blue Side being the team that's coming down from Winners Bracket and having side select for the early part of this series is gigantic. Remember, in Winners Finals, all 5 games ended up going to the team that had Blue Side throughout that entire series, and so far, so good, at least for AL being able to pick up the win in game number 1. I will say, though, this didn't really feel like a gigantic draft difference or anything like that. It didn't feel like, the side mattered all that much, or that one team kind of threw it away and was always going to be on the back foot. This was a better performance by Anyone's Legend in a draft scenario that I think was pretty even for both of these teams. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Of course, if you are new, what we're going to do is talk about draft for a couple of minutes here, hopefully 2 to 3 minutes, and then kind of talk about how that expressed itself into the actual game itself. We'll be giving player of the game, data of the game, all of that you can already see up on your screen. But let's go ahead and talk about draft. Again, I don't think there's really all that much of a difference between these two teams in terms of how they want to execute. This is a standard, fearless best of, 5 game 1 draft where a lot of the power picks are kind of being taken off the board here, or at least a lot of the power strategies Archie's, the two best top laners in the game, are taken off the board, and we'll talk about the Gwen. Gwen, for me, like when you look at these drafts, she's the Omega in terms of just how do you stop Gwen in the back half of this game. I think both teams really have a lot of opportunities not only to find their damage in the back half of the game, because Gwen, Corki, Aurora is obviously going to hurt. Same with Rumble, Yone, even the Lucian, like that's still going to be a problem in the back half of the game, but it's really going to be about who's overextending, who's getting picked off more regularly, and where is that gold going, and we'll talk about how that ended up impacting things. But that's where I think Gwen really specializes as a champion. Typically, I've actually been pretty vocal about how I think Rumble theoretically outscales Gwen, because while Gwen is functionally going to do more damage in a lot of these exchanges, Rumble is just so much easier to operate in these teamfight situations throughout the back half of the game that oftentimes Rumble's actually going to be doing more consistent damage than Gwen in a lot of these situations. I did not feel that way coming out of this draft. There's really no one on the side of BLG that has a good answer to the Gwen. Outside of that, though, again, you have a lot of damage coming in. I think you spike a little bit harder in the late game if you're BLG, if only just because I think it's really hard to imagine a world where, you know, as much damage as, you know, Corki and Aurora are going to be able to do, like if you can't get on the backline with Braum and potentially even Sejuani playing relatively safe, you know, Yone not really being a priority target in a lot of these fights, I have a hard time believing that, you know, champions like Gwen and Aurora are going to be able to put out their big pieces of damage. And Sej and Braum should be pretty difficult to break through just from a Corki alone on the front line, unless Gwen is crazy fed. You still have the Rumble ultimate, and I think Sejuani Yone is very scary. Lucian has done a lot of damage throughout a lot of these games, and Elk is a very proficient team fighter. You know, I was looking at BLG just maybe scaling a bit better, but AL spikes so hard in the mid game, as does BLG, right? Both of these comps are, you know, pick comps, if you really want to put it like that want to play through the mid game. You know, that's what you get when you get Vi versus Yone, but at the end of the day, I think there's more opportunities for AL, and that's where they ended up getting their biggest lead in this game, and that's why my player of the game is pretty obviously going to KL in the bot lane, or in the support position, I should say, on the rel. This guy's just unbelievable. I feel so, like, honored to have been on the train for KL, like, many, many years ago. 2022, I was just, like, all in on this guy. I will never not remember that 2022 Sandbox team. I will always kind of think about, you know, the Krakow Prince KL, like, trio that ended up playing for that team. Of course, Dove and who was it? Closer in the mid lane as well. That kind of, you know, made things work. But at the end of the day, those three players were so good that year that they basically got an entire career out of it. Now, some of them, you know, not necessarily, you know, looking as good now. Prince and Krakow, you know, Krakow's been okay for Bro, but that team has just been a disaster. Prince is just gone. Like, that guy has proven to not be able to carry that 2022 momentum over. But KL, he's the best of the bunch. And honestly, I probably could have told you at that time that he was going to be that. He really was that good for that Sandbox team. Even when that team was garbage in 2023, he still showed a lot of really nice signs. He finally gets a chance to play on a good team last year, and he shows that he can perform at a high level in the LPL, and whatever, man, like, he's the best support in the world this year, at least in terms of production. I think that there is an argument that that could go to Delight or Duro or anybody over in the LCK, but in terms of the LPL, it's not even really been all that close. On is the only player that can even try and match that kind of production, but KL has been better, and he showcased that here. The playmaking ability that he had in the mid game, not only to find every pick that they were looking for, but to take advantage of specifically Knight and Elk every single time they were out of position was ginormous, and those team fight engages were also massive to be able to close out the game. He really just was everything that you could want out of an engaged support on a pick comp with Vi, with Aurora, with a lot of these things that want to try and generate pressure in the mid game. He understood that he needed to be aggressive, and that's exactly what he was. And that's really why this game spiraled out of control so quickly, with AL kind of dominating it for the most part. It's just those engages and, you know, the pick opportunities going in favor of them. I think you can give a lot of credit to both Shanks and Hope as well. I think they played great, especially in comparison to their carry partners on the other side of this matchup, Knight and Elk, who I think both had tremendously awful games, which we will get into. But, you know, if Hope and Shanks are going to step up and be better than players like Knight and Elk in this series, it's not going to be close, because you can look at jungle being very much in favor of AL. You can look at support being in favor of AL. If you're getting the same thing out of mid and bot, all of a sudden the entire dichotomy of the series ends up changing. So Shanks and Hope stepping up, Shanks in particular having a really good game, I think was huge. Tarzan was really solid on the Vi. The KDA doesn't necessarily show it, but again, playing off of not only rel engage as well, but just being super aggressive and pushing the tempo very quickly was a positive, and Flandre was fine. I thought Gwen was going to be even more Omega in this game than she actually was, but turns out they didn't even really need her. Like, she could stay on the top side or the bot side and just kind of play weak side all game. AL looking great in game number one, about as good as you could possibly ask for. And then for BLG on the other side, it's not really a great showing. I'm going to be honest, you looked outclassed in this one. I don't think you got draft diffed. I think you had opportunities and options to be able to push the tempo of this game if you could control it, but you couldn't. Like, your solo laners ended up being in positions that were okay, right? Like, Knight was pretty far behind fine. Shanks was just moving around the map and doing whatever he wanted alongside the Vi because they spike harder in the mid game. Bin was doing okay, but at the end of the day, like if KL is going to find every pick and Tarzan's going to be more active than Beishwan and all of these things are going to happen, then there's no tempo, no pressure for a team that really thrives off of that. We've talked about this for BLG before. One of the big reasons why Wei didn't really ever gel with this team is because they slowed down the tempo so much with Wei in the starting lineup. Beishwan coming back in sped this team up again, and, you know, if they're going to lose tempo like they did here in game number 1, it's doomed. But part of that just comes off of mechanical misplays. Knight is going to get dud of the game. This was a really bad game number 1 for him on the Yone. He was pretty heavily gapped by Shanks. He wasn't really relevant in any of these mid-game skirmishes. As a champion, that's probably one of the more relevant, you know, in that stage of the game in the entirety of League of Legends. It's really just not a great look for Knight, who was already showing some up and down moments, not only in the semifinals, but before this in the playoffs as well. He had been white hot coming into the playoffs, the best player in the LPL once again in the final 3 to 4 weeks of the split. Not a great game number 1 from him. They're going to need more out of him. And the same thing for Elk, who I think also played pretty bad on the Lucian, was just overextended. He was a big reason why there was gold going over to AL. You talk about KL finding these picks that he was able to get in the mid game. Well, a lot of those were on Elk, and a lot of those were Lucian just being too far forward because his range is quite low. This is the trade-off. Instead of playing Lucian with something like Nami or Milio, playing it with Braum means that, you know, Elk or Lucian in this case has to be significantly more stable and safe, and he just wasn't that in the mid game. Like, Hope was just better. KL was certainly just better. On was not great protection. Beishwan had no tempo, really got completely out jungled in this one. Bin was, I guess, fine, you know, on the Rumble, but like, who really cares? The game was over by the time that Bin was even involved in everything else that was going on. It's a bad loss in game number 1 for BLG, and they pretty much have to bounce back. Going down 0-2 to AL is not a great spot to be in, but they were able to pick up every single win on blue side last series, game 2 and game 4, after they dropped game number 1. We'll see if they can have that same tempo this time, or if AL is going to be able to take a pretty dominant 2-0 series lead. Well, the winner of game number 2 was Anyone's Legend. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, and things are looking quite scary for Bilibili Gaming moving forward. They're down 0-2 now in this series, and you know what? That is not where I would want to be if I'm BLG. Having to win all 3 of the final 3 games against AL is a monumental ask of a team that, quite frankly, has not been able to show that they can show up in these big moments just yet. Yes, they played well in their wins against AL, but they also got blasted in their losses, and now they're sitting here having to not make a single mistake really for the rest of this series. It is looking pretty dire, and it's looking pretty fantastic for Anyone's Legend, who is now in full control of whatever happens throughout the rest of this finals, and they did it based off of their gameplay yet again, because as we get to talking about draft, while this game might not have been as dominant and definitely was a bit more back and forth than what we got in game number 1, it was just as bad in my opinion in terms of just watching AL be better at executing their draft than BLG is at executing theirs, because I don't really think that either of these drafts are all that like strong in terms of how this game is going to go moving forward. I talked about game 1 thinking both drafts were actually pretty solid and that neither was going to have a gigantic lead over the other. The second part of that is still true here for game 2, but mostly because I don't think either of these drafts really have a ton going for them, especially the later this game gets. Specifically, you look at BLG's on blue side here, you draft the Talia on B1, perfectly fine. The Poppy as kind of the answer or the counter to the Pantheon, totally fine. And Bessa to be able to punish Sion in lane, totally fine. And then, you know, pairing that up with Misfortune and Leona in isolation, totally fine. Pretty fine into Nautilus. You know, Jhin does a good job of, you know, countering that MF. But generally speaking, I don't hate the idea of all these champions individually with the game state that you've set up. But how exactly are you going to play out fights later on in the game if you're BLG? I continue to be on this track because I talk about this a lot on the channel. Teams really seem to believe in Talia as like a primary carry in these team fights. I'm not sold, like especially after Knight had that game number 1. I'm really not sold at Talia being your option to play in the late game. Now that being said, it's not like AL is staring down the barrel of a late game where they have a ridiculous amount of damage, but what AL do have is a comp that I think has more agency in the mid game because of their double global with Pantheon and Ryze, and more damage in the late game, specifically more frontline with Sion and Nautilus to be able to break through. Yes, Leona and Mbessa are going to be annoying. Poppy is going to be good frontline, but I really do think you have more setup for AL. You have a better mid game, and I think you're in a decent spot. If Talia's not able to move around the map super consistently in the early game, I'm talking specifically like right at level 6, like level 6 to 8 or 9, then I don't think BLG really have an easy game here, and that's kind of the situation they ended up falling into themselves. I think that there were some good performances from BLG individually. You can look at Knight having a pretty decent game on the Talia, maybe not quite as good of a game as Shanks on the other side, which we will talk talk about. You can look at Bim, once again, not being the problem or the issue for BLG, but at the end of the day, no tempo, no ability to fight in the later part of the game because you drafted a comp that just gets worse and worse as the game progresses, and AL take advantage of that by utilizing their very strong macro to create advantages, and that's why Shanks is the easy choice for player of the game. In game number 2, this Ryze was absolutely everywhere on the map, and when you're talking about a team that really thrives around playing around jungle and playing around support and playing this big macro-oriented game, having a mid laner who can influence those fights in that way just opens up everything for what AL want to do, and that's exactly what Shanks did in this game. Of course, the Ryze is also probably the highest damage champion in terms of what this draft is expecting, not only for AL, but probably in the entire game. Pretty crazy game state for me to be able to say that, but Shanks just was a gigantic problem. Part of that plays into the strength of Hope and Kale in the bot lane. Part of that plays into the strength of someone like Tarzan playing Pantheon in the jungle. But at the end of the day, if you've got this Ryze realm warping around and also dealing the most damage, it's going to be pretty difficult to end up breaking through that. But speaking of damage, credit to Hope in the bot lane as well. 13, 3, and 14 on this Jhin. R5 Jhin, I think, is something that is utilized a little bit too little for my personal interests. I think that Jhin is a really good counter pick AD carry. He doesn't necessarily get that reputation, but specifically into things like Misfortune, I think that there are a lot of opportunities for these utility AD carries to be more, plug and play rather than, we'll blind pick Jhin or Ashe and then just kind of hope and pray that they can stay weak side bot. I think Jhin can have practical applications where he can actively try and win the game, and this is exactly one of them. Hope has always been a great Jhin player. Go back to his time on JD Gaming when he really was like a great Jhin player, and so, excited to see him be able to pull it out here in the finals and do well. Tarzan and KL, just like in game number 1, were kind of the ones pushing the tempo forward. This time it was more so Tarzan than it was KL, but it still was both of them playing incredibly well, and Flandra just hyper stable on the top side. Instead of the Gwen, it's the Sion this time. Very different ideas in terms of how they want to play the game, but just as effective nonetheless. It's just a great showcase from AL. Were there moments in this game that things could have gotten a little bit, further away for AL and, they could have dominated a bit more? Maybe, but at the end of the day, I don't think their comp was perfect. They just played it better, and they certainly ended up stepping up when it mattered. And for BLG on the other side, this draft is garbage. It's actually garbo. I really don't like any of these choices. I like them in isolation. Again, I kind of went through and I was like, okay, well, Taliyah on B1 makes a lot of sense. Opens up options, certainly takes away the Taliyah Pantheon combo from AL. Makes a lot of sense. Poppy is a great counter to Pantheon. Really easy to be able to shut him down in the mid game if you are able to be at those fights. And Bessa can kind of take advantage of the weak laning of Sion. All this stuff, yada, yada, yada. But when it all comes together for the package that you have on display, you don't really have a lot of options, especially as this game goes along. If you're not up in gold early, it's basically impossible for me to imagine a world where this BLG team is actually going to be able to fight in the late game, and that's exactly where we got it. It ended up hitting 30, 35 minutes. We ended up getting to multiple Barons, and BLG just didn't have the firepower to actually keep up with AL in these games. Beishwan, for me, is going to get dud of the game. I think the biggest problem here is that when you draft something like Poppy as the quote-unquote counter to Pantheon, you need to actually be able to counter him. You need to be able to take him out of the game. Tarzan was mega active in this one. Tempo was entirely on his side, and that's going to be the biggest possible problem for BLG if Beishwan can't stay involved. This Poppy game was just not good enough, and I think the concern when it came to Beishwan as a player, being introduced as the new starting jungler for Bilibili Gaming was, can he compete mechanically with a lot of these top-tier junglers, some of the best players in the world, players like Tarzan that he's going to have to be just as good as if this team wants to be able to move forward. At least so far in this series, the answer to that has been no, even on things like Sejuani and Poppy that are generally useful, basically no matter the circumstance, and also play into the strengths of Beishwan as a player. He's got a good mind, not so much great hands, and so you want to try to get him on these facilitators. Even when he's on these champions, it feels like he's getting outclassed, which is really a bad sign for BLG. And even on top of that, right, Knight had a better game than he did in game 1. Shanks still gapped him in terms of the pressure and the macro sense that he had. When you're playing Ryze into Taliyah, whichever one's going to have more pressure on the map, that's the one that's going to win, and Shanks did a better job in this game than Knight did through the first 2 games. It's not even really been close. Shanks has absolutely been the better mid laner, and again, that's kind of a big turning point for these two teams in a series like this. Elk has been outclassed both games super hard. Elk's actually having a really terrible finals so far. The first 2 games, he's looked incompetent, like an AD carry that's not supposed to be here. On definitely doesn't look as active as KL, although I don't think this game is his fault really in any way, but what are you to do when basically everybody on your team feels like they're just not as good as the opposition? That's where AL is kind of pressuring their advantage right now, and for BLG, obviously your back is up against the wall. Not only do you need to win every single game in order to come back in this series, but quite frankly, you need to win game number 3 just to not get swept. I think the morale on this team is going to tank if you end up getting swept in the finals after being so close in winners finals, a team that should come in mechanically more talented. If you get blasted, like destroyed in this series and are the worst team, 3-0, not close, you're going to MSI with as little confidence as possible. Even if you don't win the series, I think you kind of have to win this game number 3. But for anyone's legend on the other side, if you can close this out in a 3-0 sweep for your first ever title, talk about cementing yourself as the best team in the LPL right now going to the midseason invitational. So are they going to be able to close this out in a sweep, or is BLG going to keep this alive at the very least for one more game? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to stay alive at the very least for one more game in this series and not tie it up or anything like that, but just go 2-1. And honestly, for a lot of this game, it felt like this was going to be an even easier proposition than whatever the hell we got. By the end of this, somehow, some way, AL end this game up in gold despite being down by like 7,000 for a majority of the mid game. That's how bad things got for BLG. It looked like they were going to throw away their final game in the finals here in the back half of this, but they hang on, they win the last fight that they need to, and they end up ending the game. Obviously, you know, big stuff from BLG. You're happy to see them be able to at least win one here, but this was not a convincing victory by any stretch of the imagination. You're looking at a draft that falls off super hard in the late game, and that's exactly what they did. They fell off incredibly hard. They still were able to close things out, but this was not a walk in the park. For anyone's legend, maybe you make the argument that this was the better game out of them than it was out of BLG, right? Like, I think that there is something to be said along the lines of whenever you lose a game up in gold, especially being down 7K at some point, they make the comeback, all that stuff, that you were the team that deserved to win, but they didn't win, and that's really all that matters at the end of the day. They have a draft that should scale incredibly well into the late game, and yet somehow, some way, even with that gold lead, they're not able to close things. But obviously, let's go ahead and talk about it. We talk about the drafts. This is the first time in the series that it really does feel like these two teams have different identities in terms of how they want to play the game. BLG obviously indexing into trying to find that tempo early on in these games that they've pretty heavily lacked throughout the last couple of performances. It's been very tough for this team to find inroads in order to, I guess, feel comfortable playing with the tempo that they have. But in this one, they draft, you know, Ezreal Karma down in the bot lane to try and, you know, I guess push the tempo early. The Jace on B1. It's very clear from the beginning of the draft that their direction is very aggressive. And you know what? They kind of capitalize on that. By 30-ish minutes into this game, you're looking at like a 7K gold lead for BLG. They do a great job of actually being able to set things up, and obviously we'll get into some of the later fights, but for AL, it's all scaling on the side of them. You're looking at like a crisscross wire here because all the engage that they have, the Ornn on the top side, obviously the Wukong, who's probably the best teamfight engage in the entire game at the current moment. Even like an Annie Flash can be a form of engage to set up for this late game front to back, like let's play through Sivir type of comp that they end up establishing for themselves. While it doesn't necessarily work out in the way that they want because they are so far down, that team fighting ability does allow them to pull themselves back into this game when it felt like everything was out of control for them. They give up Soul, they give up all these Barons, they don't have Grubs, they don't really have anything going for them, and yet they're still able to outposition because of their champions. And so it is kind of a dichotomy in draft. That being said, it's just too much. Like the gold lead that you're surrendering in the early game is just a little bit too strong for anyone's legend, and they just don't give themselves enough leeway to actually be able to find a foothold in this series. So I guess we can talk about what actually happened now. Player of the game is honestly pretty tough to give because it's really hard to point to one player and be like, you played well the entire way through. There were no problems, no concerns. That was not the case for anybody on BLG, but I think the closest we come to that realization is probably Elk in the bot lane, which is why he's getting my player of the game. I think Broadcast ended up giving it to Knight. I do understand that Knight makes the big play in the back half of this game on the Sylas, and his good plays were incredible just throughout the entire game, but his bad plays were pretty awful throughout a lot of this game as well. Elk was the only one that felt particularly consistent, at least for me, in terms of how game 3 ended up going down. This Ezreal was just pumping out damage on the back end of these fights, you know, kind of highlighted by the fact that he did most damage in the game by a very large margin, even over something like Sivir. Once we get to 41 minutes, it just goes to show how consistent he was in a lot of these situations. Could he have been more aggressive? Maybe. Was he the one making the big plays at the end of the game? No, he definitely was not that. I think that you could point to almost anybody else on the team and say, like, you were the one who stepped up when they needed them, but at the end of the day, like, getting there in the first place was already the big deal for BLG, and in terms of consistency, something I really highly value, Elk was probably the one who ended up standing out in that regard. If you wanted to give it to Knight for the Sylas plays in the back half of the game, I think that that is also at least kind of understandable, but at the end of the day, like, Knight's bad plays were still pretty bad in this game, and the Sylas was also pretty unpredictable in terms of playing with the rest of this team and with a lot of the setups that were actually there. So I just couldn't really reasonably give it to Knight, even if, again, he was kind of the savior at the end of this one. But dud of the game is actually going to stay on the winning side here. I really try not to do this all that frequently, especially in the playoffs, but Beishwan was the worst player on the Rift. This Skarner did nothing throughout this game. Like, even in the big moments, you know, you can highlight some parts where Skarner landed an Impale, and it looked pretty decent, right? But, like, throughout 90% of this game, I feel like Beishwan was the worst player on the Rift, and I just think that that's unacceptable to be able to say. I think his lack of ability to close out games or to really understand what he's supposed to be doing in big moments and high pressure situations has really held BLG back, not only in this series, but in others as well. And someone like Tarzan is just perfectly prepped to be able to take advantage of a situation like that. So for me, Beishwan is dud of the game, regardless of the fact that his team ended up winning. You know, if you have a problem with that, let me know in the comment section below. If you think that I'm underrating how BLG ended up playing a majority of this game, then go ahead and tell me down there. Bin and On were generally okay. Bin is in a pretty tough matchup. Again, you know, Jace into Ornn. Ornn just kind of shuts down the early aggression that Jace wants to put out. And the Karma was there to facilitate what the Ezreal wanted to do and even what the Sylas wanted to do in the back half of the game, but overall On was much more of that, a facilitator, than he was any sort of like playmaker or creator throughout this game. But BLG, all they needed to do was win, and that's exactly what they did. And then for AL on the other side, if you could get any objective control in this game, it's probably in the bag, like actually just genuinely over for AL. The fact that they gave over basically everything on the map, it meant that the fact that they were winning fights didn't really end up turning into anything throughout the end of the game, and obviously it all just kind of comes crumbling down for them at the end. I think that there are some, you know, positives to talk about. Hope and Kale kind of did their thing down in the bot lane. Kale in particular on this Milio, I actually thought played really well. Really nice game from him, just not really a lot of agency coming in from Milio as a champion, especially when you're not playing with like a super aggressive ADC, something like that Lucian that we normally see paired up with Milio. When you're playing Sivir, who's just going to naturally be a bit more passive in terms of how the early game goes, it's a bit difficult to actually pressure any sort of positives that you're giving your team, but the bot lane was generally fine. Hope was not the issue in the back half of the game. Tarzan was not the issue here on the Wukong. Some unbelievably good engages. Obviously, there are some negatives down the stretch of this game as well, but, you know, for the most part, Tarzan was the better jungler by a large margin. Shanks actually had a really decent gold lead for parts of this game overnight and took advantage of some of his mistakes, but Knight was probably better when it mattered the most. Flandra was just playing Ornn. He's usually pretty good as frontline. He was pretty decent in this game, but also not necessarily perfect. Like, you can point out like small minor errors, but again, AL tried to make the comeback and it just didn't end up working. If they had had slightly more control at the beginning of this game, or had gotten anything really in terms of the trades other than just kills and gold on targets that, you know, probably already were going to scale, then maybe this game would have gone the other direction and maybe this would have been a 3-0 sweep. I certainly don't feel better about BLG's chances coming out of this, but at the end of the day, they stayed alive, and that's really what you can ask from a team like this in Game 3. If they can come out now and win Game number 4, if they can push this series to a tied at 2-2, you know, kind of series circumstance, who knows, right? You play, you know, a 1v1 to try and get side selection for that Game 5, and anything can happen in one singular game. So now, BLG, you know, they're gonna have to step up. If they can do this one more time, things get very interesting. If AL, though, can just kind of get back to their own roots and actually play their own style like they have throughout the beginning part of this series and get those early leads, then I think that's going to be a big problem for a BLG team that, quite frankly, has not shown any ability to outplay AL at any point throughout this series. So obviously still a big game number 4. This could still be the end of the series. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Anyone's Legend. They are going to take game number 4. They are going to take this series 3-1 and officially your 2025 LPL Spring Split Champions for the first time ever are Anyone's Legend. I'm so excited for this org, for these players. I'm going to go on a bit of a selfish tangent at the beginning of this segment because while I am excited to talk about this game, this is just such a huge moment for me individually as a League fan, as an LPL fan. Again, I don't know how long you guys have been watching. You know, you all will have probably joined at different parts. Some of you probably just started watching this year. Some of you might be watching all the way from back in 2022 when I started doing these basically every single day. You know, I appreciate you nonetheless, no matter when you started watching, but if you have been along for that journey, if you've been around for the LPL videos in 2022, 2023, you know, even last year in 2024, then you will really know just how cathartic this entire situation is for me individually as an LPL fan, as an Anyone's Legend believer, and somebody who's constantly put stock into this organization and defended them from a lot of the community, defended, you know, their decisions in the offseason. I thought that they were always trying. It really felt like every year this team was throwing stuff at the wall, seeing what stuck, and unfortunately, it just always didn't work. I thought they were making good decisions in hindsight. The process, it was always really solid, but it just never translated to any results. Players like Zhao Hao that I've been super high on throughout his entire tenure in the LPL came from anyone's legend. And obviously, you know, there are a lot of times where I've just sat there and said that this team is going to be top 10. They're going to be 9th or 10th in the league, and then they end at 14th or whatever. Last year was the first time this team showed any sign of promise after signing a bunch of my channel darlings like KL. And then obviously they go out and get one of the biggest channel darlings I've ever had in Tarzan this offseason. One of my favorite players of all time. In fact, I think I'd go out on a limb and say he probably is my favorite player of all time. And speaking of Tarzan, the 7 times the charm, I guess, for him, huh? He finally gets a trophy in one of these major regions. He wins the LPL. This is his 4th straight LPL finals, his 7th finals of his career, and he's never been able to pick up a win in any of them. This was finally the time for Tarzan to step up, and not only was he able to do it, he was able to do it as the best player on the team. I don't think anybody's really going to be arguing that. KL's really good down in the support position, and obviously those are the 2 biggest channel darlings I've had, but Tarzan is the best player on anyone's legend, and he carried this team to a finals, to a championship, to an international berth. And you know, again, like I've defended him so much from criticism. I got so much hate in 2023. Like I actually can't express just how many comments I got in 2023 on these LPL videos that were like, you're an idiot for defending Tarzan. And I had to go on rants every single week in the regular season for these LNG fans that were trashing Tarzan and talking about him as a player that, you know, deserved to be teamless. He's teamless at the start of last year. It takes Weibo Gaming picking him up midway through the season in order for him to have a shot. He goes to finals, he goes to semis at Worlds, and everything is clicking. But this is even more impressive, in my opinion, being able to be the guy who leads a championship caliber team. It's everything for Tarzan. So again, just like all these narratives coming together, I would like to consider an AL victory here a win for the channel as a whole. And I know some people are going to be like, you're diminishing and, you know, making this about you and yada, yada, yada. I promise we'll get to the game and talk about these players because I'm so excited for them. And I just, you know, I wanted to talk a little bit about, you know, how important this is, I guess, to the channel as a whole, with just how vocal I've been about these players, about this organization, for it all to come together and for them to actually be able to lift up the trophy, be the #1 team in the LPL by a considerable margin. It's just so fun. It's so exciting. But with that out of the way, the little selfish ramble out of the way after game number 4 here, let's talk about what actually happened in this 4th and final game, starting off with the draft breakdown between these 2 teams. You know, I really like these 2 drafts. I think obviously they're both trying to approach this game from very different angles. I think AL has one of those classic drafts where it's like, okay, well, you're probably going to have Prio in the early game because Zed is just going to be everywhere on this map. Jax is good into Gnar early at the very least, unless Gnar is playing, you know, really safe and, you know, can't really be taken advantage of. Galio is, you know, there to kind of be a little bit easier in the early game into something like Cassiopeia until she starts getting online. Of course, the Zed can really punish either of those champs, specifically the Cassiopeia, pretty heavily in the early game. And so you're looking at an advantage in the early game here for anyone's legend, but their mid game is pretty poor. I don't really see them having any ability to skirmish as long as BLG actually plays the game well, and BLG scale incredibly well. I think AL does pick back up in the later part of the game because Jax can start split pushing. You've got the Galio to be able to answer in a 1-3-1 circumstance. Varus is going to be super consistent in that phase of the game. Zed by that time will have a lot of gold and will be able to take down a lot of people in one shot. So like AL will get back online, but BLG is going full scaling. Cassio Xayah as this double carry comp with a Gnar frontline, Rakan as a playmaker, Trundle being able to steal stats from either the Galio or the Trundle or whoever you want it to be, not the Trundle, the Galio or the Jax on the other side of that matchup, whoever you want it to be. In AL, they should have the pressure early. They are likely going to need a gold lead because while they do also scale relatively well, their mid-game priority probably not as good as Bilibili's on the other side. And AL took that to heart and said, well, if we're going to generate some gold early, then we might as well generate a lot of gold early. And almost all of it is going to be through not only my player of the game here in game 4, but my finals MVP, my player of the series, and that's Tarzan in the jungle. I very much considered multiple members of the team for this award for finals MVP. I think Tarzan absolutely earned it in this game. Not only did he take over game number 4 on the Zed, but he was really dominant in doing so. But I think if you wanted to give this to either Shanks or KL, it should go to one of those 3. I think all 3 of them were absolutely tremendous in this series, and all of them gapped their opponents. The reason I'm considering Shanks, which we will talk about more, is quite frankly, you can look at almost all 4 games and say that he was better than Knight on the other side, and taking Knight out of the equation in a series like this is doomed for BLG. They're not going to be able to answer that. But KL was probably the biggest playmaker across this this entire series. He still was great on the Renata, but I'm specifically, again, looking at that game number 1 that he really was able to take over on the Rel. It's just hard for me to go against Tarzan, especially because he was the best player in this closeout, and he really did dictate a lot of tempo. And Beishwan on the other side, like, you want to talk about a jungle gap? There was a pretty damn big jungle gap in this series in favor of Tarzan. So for me, he's getting player of the series, that finals MVP award. But to see him do it on Zed, like, talk about a crazy set of circumstances. This guy who's known for his Sejuani, his Maokai, his Zac play, back in the day when he was, first joining the LPL on LNG, coming over from Griffin. Like, it's just crazy to see him pull out Zed and dominate on it in a closeout finals game. It's just really cool. Like, again, like, it's like if Peanut did that. It's like if Peanut played Zed in a, game 5 in the LCK finals. It would be a crazy thing to see, but Tarzan doing it and taking over on it, it's just awesome, man. He dominated this game. He had his Penta stolen from him by Hope. Absolute, like, Giga Chad behavior from Hope to steal Tarzan's Penta in game 4 of the LPL finals when he's finally achieving his biggest success. Like, obviously, no flame because the game was already out of control by that point, but I would be pissed. Like, that's one of those accomplishments you probably wanted to have. I'm sure Tarzan wasn't thinking too much about it at the given time, just with how well he was playing in this game. But it's just awesome to see, and he played great in this one. Like I said, I considered Shanks because he mega gapped Knight, especially in this game, in game number 4. I think games 2 and 4 were the biggest gaps in the mid lane that we saw. Really, we'll get to Knight. He was the worst player on the Rift in this series. There was not a single player between AL or BLG that played worse in this series than Knight did, and we're going to talk about how important that was, but Shanks was incredible. He just gapped the best LPL mid laner of all time, and I don't even think it's all that up for debate. I think that that's a pretty easy sentence to make, and he did it to win his first title. KL was incredible, and he's probably the biggest support channel darling that we've ever had. God, I just love seeing him at the top, and I love seeing him be successful. He's always somebody playstyle-wise that I've kind of pushed for because I think this style is a bit undervalued by the community. Everybody wants their barrel. I want a KL who's going to be super consistent as a playmaker, who's going to get the deepest vision wards that you could possibly get, constantly set up for the rest of the team and really be a team player. That's what KL is, and, he kind of showcased that he can be more than that too. It's just this is the style that works for him. Hope was great in this series, was better than Elk in basically every game that wasn't game 3, but even in game 3, he was totally fine. Hope was not the problem, and Hope being able to get to the mountaintop here is also awesome. Flandra, being somebody who was discarded by JDG last year, who was looked at as a downgrade coming over to this team, for him to be able to be one of the best top laners in the league, to, be able to hoist this trophy, even if he wasn't as relevant in the finals as other members of this team, it's still massive. So just credit to AL, credit to all these players. I can't be happy enough with this roster. I'm literally brimming with joy as I'm recording this just because of how excited I am for them. And then for Bilibili on the other side, like, obviously it's okay to lose the finals. You're still going to MSI. You've got some time to figure things out, but there are some real concerning traits in this series. There were also some things that I think are just outliers that I don't expect to carry through to the rest of the year, but the number one thing that you have to talk about is Knight in the mid lane. He's going to get dud of the game for game 4. I don't give out a dud of the series that feels kind of BM. If I did, it would be Knight. Like, he really just was not good enough here today. There's just nothing else left to say. In the finals, this guy has pretty consistently been able to step up. He's been super successful at the LPL level, regardless of which organization or team he's been on, whether it was Top Esports, whether it was JD Gaming, whether it's Bilibili Gaming. It doesn't really matter. He's been able to take over regardless of the team that he's on, and, he's gotten pretty close to doing that for BLG once again. I think if he had played okay today, there might have been a chance for them to win this series, but if he's going to play bad, this team is in disaster mode because Beishwan got shown to be exposed in this series. He's not good enough to be able to step up. If his mid laner or top laner aren't carrying games on their own, he's not going to be able to survive. He needs those lanes to work in order for him to feel like he can participate at all at a top tier level. Elk and On weren't good enough in the bot lane, but all of this kind of fixes itself if Knight has any sort of pressure in the mid lane. That just didn't really happen. Even the game that he did have that big play at the end of game number 3 on the Silas, he wasn't very good throughout a majority of that game. He was down in gold for a lot of that game, and so you just don't feel good about where Knight is sitting at here for BLG. 2-6-2 on the Cassiopeia, R5, like, they really invested into him in this final game, and it did not work out. Again, Beishwan was pretty awful in this series. I think the other player that I do want to criticize is Elk, who just kind of needed to be better here today. He was really good in game 3, but games 1, 2, and 4, he was just really far behind in terms of tempo. Hope outclassed him, and that's unacceptable. Hope is not a player that's good enough for you as Elk to be like, yeah, it's okay that I lost to him in the finals. Like, it should not be happening if you are Elk. And On also also just wasn't aggressive enough. It's a little bit of a different story because his, I guess role partner or role opposite on the other side of this in KL is definitely better than On, and so you're not quite as concerned, but On has been on fire in the playoffs. He's arguably been this team's best player, specifically in their playoff run, and so for him to have basically a series where I never mentioned him, it's not really a good sign when he's on these playmakers. And then, Bin was on the top side. He wasn't the problem. He certainly wasn't the solution, but I'm not going to blame him entirely for how this series ended up going. BLG have a lot of things they need to work out, but again, I think that there is reason to believe that it's going to fix itself. Knight's not going to play like this in every series moving forward. This was an outlier kind of series for Knight. The only concerning thing to come out of this for BLG is that if Knight and Bin aren't winning, if Elk and On aren't dominating, Beishuan's going to look like a Thunder Talk jungler. Like, that's the version of him that's going to be there if you're not getting these dominant lanes, but I imagine things will turn around once these players actually get back into their own form, but they were not on it here today, and that means that anyone's legend is walking out of here as champions. I'm just so freaking excited for this team, for this organization, for these players. They've all earned it. They've all put in the work, and it's finally paying off for them. All right, but that is going to do it for my LPL Finals overview and analysis video, and we're done with the spring split. Congratulations to anyone's legend, to Flandra, Tarzan, Shanks, Hope, and KL for picking up their championships. Some of them their first, most of them their first, and obviously, Flandra on the top side as well, former world champion, being like, I've been here before. I feel pretty good about this one, but just a really awesome accomplishment overall here for anyone's legend, and now they're going to get the chance to prove that they belong here and belong in the upper echelon because they're going to MSI as the #1 seed from the LPL. Of course, they get slotted immediately into the main stage. Bilibili's going to have to go through the play-ins. I don't think they're going to struggle too much in that category. Of course, only 2 teams make it out of the play-ins, and so, we will see how that ends up going. No Korean team down there and no North American team down there, just going to be the #2 seed from the LEC, #2 seed obviously here from the LPL, and then the #2 seed from the PCS, as well as the LTA South representative in Furia, who did end up qualifying this morning. Congratulations to them, but excited to see what BLG can do, and even more excited to see what AL can do. If this team can make an international final, how freaking awesome is that going to be? I'm just very excited to see that, but of course, we've still got more finals content coming up on this channel. We've got the LTA North and the LCK in order to cover and kind of close out their playoffs before we start getting into some MSI coverage on this channel. I'm excited for all of that. If you are as well, hit the subscribe button. All that stuff's going to be coming out pretty shortly within the next couple of days, and then of course MSI coverage will be around the corner. But also, if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all